What is good, all you cool cats and kittens? This is your Commissioner Tim, back at it after a long 3 weeks since my last appearance, dropping the mid-season analysis as well as the video. And as promised last week, here we are, back at it to cover the Week 12 action. We are in the last stretch, boys. Just 2 more games remaining. And the playoff race is up in the air still. I would have never predicted this with how things looked in week 6, but here we are with just 2 top seeds locked in, and then 4 teams in real contention for the 3rd and the 4th remaining playoff seats. We also know that at least the 4th seed will not be decided until after the last game of the season next week. So this race is incredibly hot. And this week has a lot of potential. Week 13 that we're heading into has a lot of potential narratives to make it even more interesting for the last week of the season. So as your commissioner, your co-commissioner for our inaugural Dynasty season, I could not have wished for something better to wrap up this season as we get into the playoffs. So I'm going to do a quick recap of Week 12 in a slightly different format without going into individual fantasy player performances like I've done in the earlier parts of the season, but rather focus on the playoff ramifications for all of our league and our managers as we go into the last 2 games remaining for the season. So all 4 matchups last week actually carried some playoff implications, every single one of them. I'm going to start off with our matchup 1 in Half Chubb versus the Washington Fantasy Football Team. This was an absolute must win for the Washington Fantasy Football Team, and I'll talk about this in a next section going about the playoff narratives, but this was an absolute must win, and he was able to sneak out, Adam was able to sneak out a narrow 2-point victory that was decided on Monday Night Football. I mean, with the slow start by Terry McLaurin in the game, and also knowing that the Seattle's offense has been struggling, it looked like a potential upset was in the works for Half Chubb playing that spoiler role. But Tyler Lockett actually ended up getting most of the entire Seahawks receiving work, as DK Metcalf only recorded his first reception, I believe, in that 4th quarter. So really, between Terry's and Tyler Lockett's collective 19-point performance, subpar, but that was enough to sneak out the 2-point victory here. So this was a massive win for Adam. This win allowed for the Washington Fantasy Football Team to tie up Trust the Process, who lost in Week 12 for the 4th seed at 6-6. A loss here for the Washington Fantasy Football Team would have likely plummeted Adam's chances at playoffs this year, and likely meant that it probably at least secures Trust the Process playoff probabilities. And after sliding 4 straight since Derrick Henry's injury, Adam is still in the race after this clutch narrow win. So I'll talk about the playoff race shaping up in detail after going over all the remaining matchups. Over to matchup 2, Cup to Canada versus Ben Campo. So this win, obviously this week, Cup to Canada, congratulations on scoring the league's high against the league low by Ben this week. But Eve's win here means actually less for the playoff implications than Ben's loss in terms of the playoff berth. So Ben had a chance to gain a game on Trust the Process, and if so, it would right now be sitting at a 3-way tie for the 4th seed in terms of the standings heading into the last 2 weeks of the season. But with the loss here, Ben is now needing to win out the remaining 2 games to potentially sneak into the playoffs. Ben will need some luck as well, but this is really interesting. So again, I'll talk about that in a little bit. So Cup to Canada now sitting at 8-4 is just a game behind Brady Stir Dynasty. He has locked a playoff spot at this point with this win. So congratulations, Eves, being the 2nd team in our league to really secure that playoff berth. So it's just a matter of where Eves finishes out this season at this point in terms of his playoff seeding. for the remaining 2 games that he'll be playing for. But at least also for just this season, there's no advantage to seeding come playoff time. It'll be the same head-to-head, 1-week format without any extra points being awarded to finishing the regular season with the higher seed. So congratulations on the victory, Cup to Canada and Yves. This victory has secured you likely a top 2 playoff spot for this season. Over to matchup 3, Brady Stir Dynasty versus Chota. Brady Stir Dynasty secured his playoff berth in week 10, so it's been a while. It's the first team to secure it, and sitting at league leading 9-3 now after 12 weeks. Brady Stir Dynasty is just playing for the top seed at this point. The race will come down to him and Cup to Canada for that top seed. For Brady Stir Dynasty, though, in week 12 was actually quite big, and the reason why I think it's really 2 players that showed up or changed. The 2 big names for me was that Antonio Gibson got his biggest workload of the season so far in week 12. It looks like he's finally started to come back from that nagging shin fracture. Maybe that bye week recently sort of helped him recover and get that time that's needed for him to recover. So certainly a good sign. And hey, if Antonio Gibson is back, this bodes extremely well for Brady Stir Dynasty's chances at winning it all this year. The second player that I wanted to mention is Dalvin Cook. He has suffered a dislocated shoulder, which likely has him out for at least the fantasy regular season and playoffs. He may come back in the NFL playoffs, but as Ryan noted on Sleeper, his midseason trade for Alexander Mattison now likely has saved his season and keeps him as one of the favorites for the championship, especially if Mattison is able to produce the numbers he did in week 3 and week 5 when he filled in for Dalvin Cook. Over to Chota, who is now sitting at 4-8. He is eliminated from playoff contention with this loss, but he does have the ability to cause ripples to shape up the 4th seed team, as he will face both Trust to Process and the Washington Fantasy Football Team in the remaining 2 weeks. All right, over to the last matchup, which was between Trust to Process and Bills Mafia. This was likely the most important game in the league in terms of the playoff positioning in Week 12. Both teams came into the week sitting at 6-5, and whoever won was going to have a massive boost to their likelihood to make the playoffs and would have been sitting at likely the 3rd seed, and whoever lost now has an uphill climb to get that 4th and last playoff spot. So with Bills Mafia winning and now sitting at 6-7-5, this has given Bills Mafia a huge jump in terms of probability to make the playoffs and likely has that 3rd seed. He's still not built in, guaranteed that 3rd seed, let alone playoffs, and we'll talk about right after this matchup review. But now Trust to Process sits at 4th seed at 6-6. But talking about Trust to Process, my team, it was a terrible week for me overall in terms of injuries. And not just injuries that affected me in week 12, but likely injuries that's going to factor in at least for the next several weeks, certainly maybe even into playoff time should I make the playoffs. DeAndre Swift suffered a shoulder injury. This, doesn't sound too serious, but the reports as of this morning is saying that he is likely to miss multiple games, which means obviously week 13 and likely week 14 at minimum. Those are the last 2 games of our season, so I may be without DeAndre Swift, who's been a godsend for me, who's helped me get to this position in the league so far. And also A.J. Brown, shortly before the games on Sunday in week 12, he was placed on IR and now is not going to be eligible to come back at least until week 16, which would be the championship week for either Toilet Bowl or the actual championship that we're playing for. So I'll be without AJB for the playoff seeding as well. So that leads me into the path for playoffs, playoff path for the entire league. So as I mentioned on the Sleeper chat, our playoff race for this inaugural league is incredible. There are technically 4 teams in the playoff race for the remaining 2 seeds. But really the race, I think, is going to be for the 4th seed, and that will be between Trust to Process, the Washington Fantasy Football Team, and Ben. I'll start with the right now the ranked third team, Bills Mafia, because Bills Mafia is also not guaranteed to secure a playoff berth at this point at all. So even though he's the most likely, he's really the favorite out of the four right now, because he is sitting at a game ahead of Trust the Process and the Washington Fantasy Football Team. And obviously, with just 2 games remaining, being a game up ahead is significant. And the reason I would say that really that 1 game difference is the biggest reason why he's sitting as a favorite is because he also faces the toughest schedule out of all the 4 teams, including Bills Mafia, that are in the playoff contention as of today. So this week, he faces the number 1 team in British Dynasty. And next week, in week 14, he will face Cup to Canada to finish out the season. Bills Mafia faces the top 2 teams to finish out the season. That said, he is also the only team who controls their own destiny to make the playoffs this year. If Brandon wins out the next 2 games, wins out the season, he's locked in at least the 3rd seed, potentially the 2nd. And if he wins just 1, though, there is a chance he misses playoffs. And if he loses out, Bills Mafia likely actually misses playoffs completely. So it's going to be a stressful remaining 2 weeks. But I'll say this, like I said, if he wins both, he controls his own destiny, he's in the playoffs. But let's say that he's to lose this week against Brady Stirred Dynasty, and it's a tight matchup in terms of projections on Sleeper. Brandon better be hoping that at least one of Trust the Process or the Washington Fantasy Football Team loses as well. So if he loses in week 13, this upcoming week, and both Trust the Process and the Washington Fantasy Football Team win, there's a chance Bills Mafia drops all the way down to the 5th seed after just this week. Who are Trust the Process and the Washington Fantasy Football Team are facing 2 of the bottom 3 teams this week as well. So that said, Bills Mafia does have a nice 52-point cushion on the points for advantage over the Washington Fantasy Football Team. So if that may be a cushion that he can potentially rebound from, even with a loss in week 13. So based on how the rating, the standings sit after this week, even with a loss, Brandon will likely be sitting at least in 4th because of that 52-point cushion against Adam. So really the games here for Bills Mafia, the remaining games, it's a really tight matchup. He's got Bills Mafia, Brady Stirred Dynasty is projected to be winning by 7 points right now. And then week 14, he's projected to lose by 6 points. So again, he's got to win both of these out to really control his own destiny. But anything can go. If he only wins 1, this means that he finishes out the season at 8-6. And obviously, Trust the Process and the Washington Fantasy Football Team technically can win out the rest of the seasons and finish out at 8-6 as well. All right, over to Trust the Process, who is currently ranked 4th. So the favorite to win at least one of the remaining playoff spots, who's currently tied with the Washington Fantasy Football Team at 6-6. What's really interesting about the playoff race that's shaping up is that the Trust the Process and the Washington Fantasy Football Team face the exact same opponents in the remaining 2 weeks, and that's against Ben and Chota. But Trust the Process currently has a 59-point advantage in terms of points for over the Washington Fantasy Football Team. So, that's going to be a cushion, like I said, for Bills Mafia that I also have over the Washington Fantasy Football Team. But that said, no one besides Bills Mafia controls their own destiny at this point. So even if I win out both, I still have to make sure that the Washington Fantasy Football Team doesn't creep up on that 59-point sort of cushion over the next remaining 2 weeks. That said, in order for Trust the Process, my team, to make the playoffs, I have to not only at least match the Washington Fantasy Football Team's remaining 2-game record, but again, I have to make sure that I keep my points for advantage in case it goes to a tiebreaker. Week 13, though, I am going up against Chota, who is without one starting QB and also no one to pick up on the waiver wire, which was part of my strategy to lock up all the remaining startable quarterbacks this week after seeing that Chota was going to be out without a QB2. But so this week, Sleeper has me projected to win by quite a big margin. But week 14 is likely the one that's the most important, which will be against Ben, who thankfully will be without Jalen Hurts as he's going to be on a bye in Week 14. Jalen Hurts has been a fantasy god this year, number 2 quarterback and number 3 overall in terms of scoring. But also, I'll be without Jonathan Taylor, who's been the reason I'm in this position to begin with. Obviously out A.J. Brown. I'll be out Mike Gesicki. And even for Week 14, likely out DeAndre Swift as well. So between Jonathan Taylor, DeAndre Swift, and A.J. Brown, if you include him as the Deontay Johnson and Michael Pittman, who I traded to get AJB, those are really the players that's gotten me to this position, and I'm going to be without them come Week 14. And so even though Sleeper has this projected to be very, very close with me winning by 2 points, I have this as a loss for me in terms of what I think is going to happen. So that's going to be an extremely difficult week for me going up against Ben. So I do see myself finishing out the season at 7-7, and likely will need to rely on the points for tiebreaker to make the playoffs. That said, if I win 2, there is a chance that I'm able to get into that 3rd seed, and with who knows, if Eves loses out, there is also a chance. Actually, he's facing Ben, so yeah, I may be able to get at best a 3rd seed at this point. Moving over to the 3rd team, the Washington Fantasy Football Team. He's currently the most likely of obviously the non-3 and 4th standing teams to likely cause an upset and get into the playoffs. The Washington Fantasy Football Team, though, because of the 0.4 cushion that the Washington Fantasy is at a disadvantage for against Trusted Process and Bills Mafia, Adam is going to need to have at least one gigantic week, potentially get to his season high levels of around that 190 that he had in the earlier season in order for him to make up that deficit, assuming both him and me, Trusted Process, we finish out with the same exact record. So this week is likely, though, for the Washington Fantasy Football Team, the most important week for him, as he's currently projected as the underdog against Ben. I think there's a good chance that the Washington Fantasy Football Team wins in Week 14 against Chota, who will also, again, be without one starting QB that week. So if Adam wins this week, count me in on betting on Adam finishing out the season at 8-6. Which, again, I think because I lose to Ben, that would mean that the Washington Fantasy Football Team likely has a great chance, or actually locks himself into playoffs if I am to go 7-7. But that said, even if he finishes out at 8-6, that's still not enough to guarantee a playoff berth at this point in terms of mathematical probability. So, but it does obviously give him the best chance to make playoffs. Again, this week against Ben, Week 13 is the matchup for Adam for the entire season. So really, I think Trusted Process and the Washington Fantasy Football Team are really in the same bucket. There is a chance that both Trusted Process and the Washington Fantasy Football Team win out. It may be that those two teams over Bills Mafia making the playoffs as well, depending on how things sort of fall into play. So every probability is right now open and out there. All right, over to the last team in play, which is Ben. I saved this best for last because I think this is the most interesting path to playoffs out of anyone. Ben is sitting 1 game behind Trusted Process and Washington Fantasy Football Team and 2 games behind the current 3rd seed in Bills Mafia. And obviously, he's behind Trusted Process and Washington Fantasy Football Team just by 1 game. But as I mentioned before, he is also in this unique position of facing both Trusted Process and the Washington Fantasy Football Team to close out the season. So he's up against the Washington Fantasy Football Team this week, projected to win against the Washington Fantasy Football Team. And then he's also up against Trusted Process, me, in Week 14. Like I said, I think Ben has a really good chance to win in Week 14, and he's projected to win this week against the Washington Fantasy Football Team. So Ben's got a really good chance to win out the season, and he's favored to win this week. Obviously, I think he's got a chance to really beat me in Week 14. That's going to mean that Ben is locked up at 7-7 if he wins out the remaining 2, which means also because he faces Trusted Process and the Washington Fantasy Football Team, that means that if Ben wins out, the ceiling for Trusted Process and the Washington Fantasy Football Team is a 7-7 finish this season as well. Trust the process, or sorry, the Washington Fantasy Football Team and Ben right now are also only separated by just 2 points on points for. And Ben is behind 61 points to trust the process. So by winning out, there's actually a great chance that Ben makes the playoffs. And there's even more than a good chance that Ben is able to win out those 2 games, given the schedule of the teams that he's facing to finish out this inaugural season. So if Ben finishes out at 7-7, I do think it's going to end up ultimately being a 3-team tiebreaker. And I'm hoping that with the 61-point cushion that I have on Ben and the 59-point cushion that I have on the Washington Fantasy Football Team, that's going to be enough for me to be able to sneak into that 4 seed in the playoffs. But if all those things play out, this circles me back all the way over to Bills Mafia. If Bills Mafia loses this week, and we see Ben beating the Washington Fantasy Football Team, keep in mind, Ben is projected to win this week, and Bills Mafia is projected to win against Brady's third dynasty by 7 points this week, but all tight. So if Bills Mafia loses this week and we see Ben beating the Washington Fantasy Football Team, we are heading into week 14, boys, with all 4 teams with similar probability to make the playoffs. And it could be that we see the currently ranked the 3rd and the 4th team in Bills Mafia and Trust the Process be outside looking in, sitting at 5 and 6, depending on how things sort of play out. So ultimately, that means that we're going to have a 4-team tiebreaker between the 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th to decide on the last 2 remaining playoff positions. So week 13 is about to be a dandy. Tune into the games, set your lineups, and let's all wish for the best. I won't be doing power rankings for the rest of the season, as come playoff times, it's anyone's game. With that said, see you Thursday, Sunday, and Monday, boys. Let's go.